Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Reckless North. The air in Solitude Bluff, Alaska was a physical thing. It didn't just fill the lungs, it seized them, a thief of warmth and breath. Marley Quinn stepped off the rattling supply plane and into its brutal embrace, the cold a slap of reality against the flushed skin of her cheeks. She was dressed for a magazine's idea of winter, not the raw, unforgiving truth of it. Her cashmere coat, the colour of a pale sunrise, was an absurdity against the stark backdrop of snow-drowned pines and the bruised purple of the mountains that clawed at the sky. She felt the eyes on her before she saw them. They were few, but their weight was immense. A handful of figures, swathed in layers of practical flannel and down, paused their work, their gazes lingering on her expensive, impractical boots. In their silence she heard a chorus of judgments, each one a nail in the coffin of the life she had been so unceremoniously ejected from. A defensive heat, sharp and familiar, pricked at her pride. She was an exile, stripped of her name, her status, her armour of wealth. Here she was just a woman in a foolish coat, a problem waiting to happen. The hub of the town, if such a grand word could be applied to the loose collection of buildings, was a long, low structure that housed a general store, a post office and a diner under one groaning roof. A hand-painted sign, its letters faded by the relentless elements, read, "The Bluff." It was here, amidst the scent of stale coffee, sawdust, and the faint, sweet smell of curing salmon, that she found her penance. The owner, a woman named Sarah whose face was a roadmap of every harsh winter she had ever endured, sized Marley up with a look that was neither kind nor cruel, but deeply pragmatic. "The work is hard," she said, her voice a low rumble. "The pay is not. You'll stock shelves, sort mail and wash dishes. You'll be on time every time. The coal doesn't care if you have a hangover." Marley, whose life had been a masterclass in avoiding anything that resembled hard work, simply nodded. "I understand." The first test came in the form of a shipment of medical supplies, a fragile cargo destined for the small clinic at the edge of town. Marley, her hands stiff and clumsy in their thin leather gloves, carried the boxes from the plane to the storefront. She stacked them with the careless haste of someone who had never considered the consequences of a thing being dropped, leaving them exposed to the biting wind as she went back for another load. It was then that she met him. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, a man who had learned not to waste an ounce of energy. His face, weathered and tanned by the wind and sun, was a study in grim endurance. He stopped before the precariously stacked boxes, his gaze sharp and critical. He didn't look at her, not at first. He looked at her work, and in his eyes she saw her own inadequacy reflected. "City carelessness," he said, his voice low and sharp, not raised but honed to a cutting edge. He began to restack the boxes with a practiced efficiency, his movements sure and steady. Marley's defensiveness flared. "I was coming right back for them." He finally turned his eyes on her, and they were the colour of a winter sky, a pale, unforgiving blue. "The coal doesn't wait." He gestured with his chin toward the boxes. "Things freeze. People get sick. This isn't a game." He turned his back to her then, addressing Sarah who had emerged from the store, but his voice was pitched for Marley to hear. "Another tourist playing homesteader. Let's see if this one lasts till the thaw." Marley stood frozen, the insult landing with the force of a physical blow. He looked at her not as a person, but as a problem he was already tired of solving. In that moment, she hated him with a sudden, surprising ferocity. She hated the quiet competence of his hands, the weary certainty in his eyes. She hated that he was right. Later, as she swept the wooden floors of the store, the scent of pine from the logs stacked by the stove mingling with the faint metallic tang of engine fuel that seemed to cling to everything. She heard the lonely whine of a Cessna taking off. She looked out the window to see the small plane climbing into the vast, indifferent sky, a speck of silver against the deepening twilight. She didn't know his name, but she knew the plane was his. It was the sound of his judgment, of his dismissal, flying away from her, leaving her alone in the crushing silence of the north. His name, she would learn, was Levi Hart, and in the stark, unforgiving landscape of Solitude Bluff, he was a force as powerful and as dangerous as the weather itself. The air between them crackled with a chemistry as sharp and as cold as the Alaskan air, an antagonistic energy that promised either combustion or ruin. The blizzard arrived without fanfare, a silent thief in the night. One moment the sky was a canvas of stars, cold and sharp as scattered diamonds. The next, the world was gone, erased by a swirling vortex of white. The handful of residents in Solitude Bluff, bound by the unwritten laws of the North, gathered in the lodge, the only building large enough and sturdy enough to withstand the full fury of the storm. Cut off from the world, the usual social barriers began to erode, worn down by the shared vulnerability of their predicament. The storm was a great equalizer, and in the warm, fire-lit common room of the Solitude Bluff Lodge, a strange temporary community was forged. It was here, in the heart of the chaos, that Marley Quinn began to thaw. The defensive chip on her shoulder, the brittle pride that had been her only armour, began to melt away, revealing something unexpected beneath. Drawing on a past life of planning charity galas and society parties, she moved through the room with a surprising efficiency. She organised the dwindling supplies, her voice calm and steady as she rationed out blankets and food. She gathered the children, her face animated as she wove fantastical stories of brave explorers and magical creatures, her voice a warm thread of light in the growing darkness. From across the room, Levi Hart watched her. He had seen the city girl, the tourist playing homesteader. He'd seen the carelessness, the impracticality, but now he saw something else. He saw a woman who moved through the chaos as if she belonged in it, as if the storm outside matched something inside of her. His judgment, once so swift and so certain, began to give way to a grudging respect. Late that night, long after the others had settled into an uneasy sleep, he found her by the large window, the firelight casting flickering shadows on her face. She was watching the snow swirl against the glass, a white, hypnotic dance. He approached her, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. He held out a thermos. "Coffee," he said, his voice a low rumble, stripped of its earlier sharpness. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt, small but undeniable, passed between them. She poured the steaming liquid into the single tin mug. The shared warmth, a small intimacy in the vast, cold emptiness of the night. They stood in a shared silence, the only sounds the crackle and scent of the birch log fire and the muffled howl of the wind, a beast held at bay by the walls of the lodge. "It has a life of its own," he said finally, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow. "The weather, you can't fight it. You have to learn to read it, to respect it." She nodded, the warmth of the coffee seeping into her bones. "I'm beginning to understand that." She hesitated, then added, her voice barely a whisper, "It's beautiful, in a terrifying sort of way." He glanced at her then, his eyes catching the firelight. For the first time he saw past the expensive coat and the city carelessness. He saw a flicker of something vulnerable, something real. "Back home," she confessed, her gaze dropping to the mug in her hands. It was possible to be in a room with 100 people and be completely, utterly alone. Here, the silence feels different, more honest. He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. In the quiet space between them, a fragile truce was formed. He saw not a tourist, but a woman wrestling with a loneliness as vast and as profound as the Alaskan wilderness. And she saw not a grim, judgmental pilot, but a man who understood the language of silence, who had found a strange sort of peace in the heart of the storm. Later, as the blizzard raged outside, Levi found himself in his own Spartan cabin, the memory of their shared silence lingering in the air. His cabin was a reflection of the man himself, tidy, functional, stripped of all but the essentials, a place of quiet contemplation, of self-imposed exile. He thought of the woman in the lodge, of the unexpected grace she had shown. He had judged her, had dismissed her. But in the heart of the storm she had revealed a strength he hadn't anticipated, a resilience that echoed the very landscape he'd come to call home. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to read the signs, to anticipate the turns of the weather. But Marley Quinn, he was beginning to realise, was a storm of a different kind, one he was entirely unprepared for. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a world scoured clean, dazzling and deceptive under a sky of brilliant brittle blue. The shared intimacy of the storm dissipated with the last of the clouds, leaving a tense, charged atmosphere in its wake. The fragile truce between Marley and Levi, forged in the firelight of the lodge, seemed to tremble in the harsh light of day. Bolstered by a newfound confidence, a sense of having weathered her first Alaskan storm, Marley felt a reckless sort of courage take root. She had been told of a pack of Arctic foxes that had been sighted near the edge of the tundra, their winter coats a thing of rare beauty. The photographer in her, a relic of a past life of idle hobbies, stirred. Ignoring the quiet warnings of the locals, the casual mentions of how quickly the weather could turn, she borrowed a snowmobile and set off, camera slung over her shoulder. The tundra was a vast, exposed expanse of white, a blank page on which the wind wrote its own merciless story. The foxes were there, a fleeting vision of silver and shadow, and for a while Marley was lost in the thrill of the chase, the click of the shutter a satisfying counterpoint to the hum of the engine. But the sky, once so clear, began to bleed at the edges, the blue deepening to a bruised purple. The wind picked up, its playful whisper turning into a mournful howl. Within minutes the world was gone, swallowed by a blinding whiteout. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Marley's bravado. Every direction looked the same, a swirling vortex of snow. The engine of the snowmobile sputtered, then died, the silence that followed more terrifying than the storm itself. She was alone, a tiny, insignificant speck in the vast, indifferent wilderness. News of her disappearance spread through Solitude Bluff with the speed of a wildfire. Every eye turned to Levi. He was the only one with a plane, the only one with a chance of finding her. But the thought of taking to the air in this weather, of flying into the teeth of the storm, was a personal hell. It was a visceral reminder of another flight, another storm, another life lost. The ghost of his partner, a memory he had tried to bury under years of rigid control and self-imposed exile, rose up, its icy fingers clutching at his heart. He stood in his hangar, the wind rattling the metal doors, the roar of the storm a mirror of the tempest in his own soul. He couldn't fly. He wouldn't. But then he saw Sarah's face, her eyes filled with a mother's terror. He saw the faces of the other townspeople, their hope a heavy, unbearable weight. And he saw Marley's face, not the reckless tourist, but the woman who had shared a mug of coffee with him in the dead of night, her voice a soft, honest whisper in the darkness. The flight was a nightmare. The Cessna, usually so steady and reliable, was tossed about like a child's toy. Ice coated the wings, the groan of the metal skin under stress a constant, terrifying chorus. Every gust of wind was a memory, every lurch of the plane a fresh wave of guilt and fear. But he flew on, his eyes scanning the blinding whiteness below, his voice a low, steady murmur as he spoke into the radio, a mantra against the screaming of the wind. He found her, a small dark shape huddled against the useless snowmobile, a splash of colour in a world of white. The relief that washed over him was a flash, a brilliant, blinding light, immediately consumed by a cold, quiet fury born of terror. Back on the ground, the warmth of the hangar a stark contrast to the frozen tundra, he confronted her. He didn't yell. His voice was low, devastating in its quiet intensity, shaking with a contained rage that was more terrifying than any shout. "That little adventure of yours," he said, his voice raw, "that feeling of being above the rules, did it feel worth it?" He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "People die up here for fun, Marley. They die because of a single stupid choice." She looked at him, her own fear and relief warring within her. She saw the anger, but she also saw something else, something deeper, a wound that was raw and bleeding. He wasn't looking at her, she realized with a sickening jolt. He was looking at a ghost, and in his eyes, she was the one who had killed her. The hard, dead silence of his locked-bin door after their fight was a wall between them, a barrier of unspoken history and bitter accusation. The rift that had opened up between them was as vast and as unforgiving as the Alaskan wilderness itself, a chasm of guilt and misunderstanding that seemed impossible to cross. The fragile connection they had forged in the heart of the storm had been shattered, leaving behind only the metallic taste of fear and the bitter sting of regret. The storm that had nearly claimed Marley returned with a vengeance, a malevolent entity that seemed determined to tear Solitude Bluff from the face of the earth. The wind howled like a banshee, and the snow fell in a thick, blinding curtain. It was in the heart of this new tempest that the town's fragile thread of existence began to unravel. Sarah, the matriarch of their small community, the woman whose face was a roadmap of every Alaskan winter, collapsed in the diner, her hand clutching her chest, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "A massive coronary," the town's part-time medic announced, his voice grim. The medevac helicopter was grounded, the storm too violent for any sane pilot to attempt a flight. Every eye once again turned to Levi. He was their only hope, their only chance of getting Sarah to a hospital before it was too late. But Levi was frozen, a man trapped in the ice of his own past. He stood in his hangar, the roar of the storm outside a symphony of his deepest fears. He saw not the churning snow, but the twisted metal of a wreck, the ghostly image of a face he could never forget. He refused to fly. The ghosts of the past held him in their icy grip, and he was powerless to break free. It was Marley who found him there, his face pale and drawn in the dim light of the hangar. She had heard the news, had seen the terror in the eyes of the townspeople. She had every reason to hate him, to fear him, to leave him to his demons. But when she looked at him, she saw not the man who had accused her, but a man who was drowning in a sea of guilt and fear. She didn't plead or accuse, she didn't try to reason with him, she simply walked up to him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, and looked him in the eye. "She needs you," she said, her voice clear and steady, a calm anchor in the howling chaos. "And I'll be your eyes. You won't be alone." Her words, simple and direct, were a lifeline thrown into the turbulent waters of his past. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, the fearless resolve in her face. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness. Her presence, her unwavering belief in him, broke through the paralysis that had held him captive. He nodded, a single sharp movement of his head. The flight was a descent into a living hell. The Cessna, a fragile shell in the face of the storm's fury, was buffeted by winds that threatened to tear it apart. Ice, thick and heavy, coated the wings, the hypnotic rhythm of the ice-laden windshield wipers a counterpoint to the frantic beating of their own hearts. But they were a team. Her voice, calm and steady, called out altitudes and headings, her eyes a second pair for him, augmenting his skill with her unwavering watchfulness. They moved as one, their voices a quiet, focused dialogue against the roar of the storm. In the claustrophobic, rattling cockpit surrounded by a churning, violent world, they became extensions of one another, two halves of a single functioning whole. They were forced to land on a remote frozen lake, the storm too intense to continue. The roar of the engine died, replaced by the howl of the wind and the groan of the plane's metal skin under stress. In the back, Sarah's breathing was soft but steady, a fragile thread of life in the overwhelming darkness. The adrenaline of the flight receded, leaving behind something raw, something intensely vulnerable. In the dim green glow of the instrument panel, Levi turned to Marley. His eyes, no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past, were filled with an emotion she had never seen before: awe. His hand, calloused and trembling slightly, came up to cup her jaw. There were no words. The kiss was a collision of gratitude, terror, and a profound, soul-deep recognition. It was not about seduction, it was about survival. He kissed her like he was breathing her in, each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest. His hands traced her back, drawing shivers that left her breathless. When their bodies pressed together in the cramped space, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of longing. In that small, fragile space, surrounded by the fury of the storm, they found a different kind of sanctuary, a quiet harbour in the heart of the tempest. The shared warmth of their breath fogged the cold air of the cockpit, a visible sign of the life, the hope that had been rekindled between them. The storm broke as the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern sky. They completed the flight, the air now still and clean, the world below a pristine blanket of white. Sarah was alive, her condition stabilized, her life a testament to their shared courage. They returned to Solitude Bluff not as a reckless heiress and a haunted pilot, but as heroes, the ordeal having burned away all artifice, all pretense. In the quiet of Levi's cabin, the air thick with the scent of fresh coffee and wood smoke, the truth, like the morning light, finally poured in. The aurora borealis, a silent dancing ribbon of green and violet, played outside his window, a celestial ballet that seemed to mirror the quiet revolution taking place within the small warm space of the cabin. He told her of the crash, his voice low and steady, stripped of the guilt that had haunted him for so long. It had been a small navigational error, his own, a moment of overconfidence in a sky he thought he knew so well. His co-pilot, his friend, had paid the ultimate price for his mistake. In return, she told him the truth of her prank, the act of reckless sabotage that had led to her exile. It had been an impulsive act, yes, but one born of a desperate, deeply moral outrage. Her father's company had been on the verge of releasing a product they knew to be faulty, dangerous. She had tried to reason with him, to appeal to his conscience, but he had dismissed her, his own daughter, as a naive child. Her act of sabotage had been a desperate attempt to be heard, to stop a wrong she could not otherwise prevent. In the soft, ethereal light of the aurora, they saw each other, finally and completely. They were not their mistakes. They were not their pasts. They were two souls who had been broken and battered, but who had found in each other a way to be whole again. The frantic energy of the storm had been replaced by a quiet so profound it felt sacred. Dawn was not yet a certainty, but a promise whispered at the edges of the sky, filtering through the window in hues of soft grey and pale lavender. In this gentle light, Levi moved toward her, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. He helped her out of her heavy clothes, and the act was a slow, reverent unwrapping. There was no haste, no fire of desperate need, like the one that had consumed them in the cockpit. This was something else entirely. His fingers, so sure and steady on the controls of his plane, were now deliberate and almost hesitant as they worked the buttons of her damp wool coat. The garment fell away, pooling at her feet, and with it seemed to fall the last of her defences, the armour she had worn for a lifetime. He paused at the thick sweater she wore underneath, his gaze meeting hers, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a complete and total surrender not to him, but to this moment they had earned. His touch was a revelation. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of a life lived in the wind and cold, were impossibly gentle against her skin. He traced the curve of her jaw, his thumb brushing over the place where a tear had frozen to her cheek hours before. The sensation sent a tremor through her, not of cold or fear, but of a deep, resonant ache. It was the ache of being found after being lost for so long. He followed the line of her throat, his touch lingering on the hollow where her pulse beat a steady, thrumming rhythm against his fingertips. The scene was a tapestry woven from the quietest sensations, the soft, yielding texture of a hand-knit wool blanket he drew around her shoulders, the faint, clean scent of wood smoke that clung to his shirt, a scent she now knew was the scent of safety, of home, the way the pale morning light caught in the strands of her hair, turning them to silver floss. He looked at her as if she were a new and uncharted territory, a landscape he was discovering for the first time, and he was determined to learn its every contour with a patient, loving reverence. When their bare skin finally touched, it was not a spark, but a slow spreading warmth, a current of pure recognition that flowed between them. His hands on her back were not demanding but steadying, a silent promise of support. Her hands resting on the hard planes of his chest felt the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. Their coming together was a silent conversation, a language of touch and breath, and shared glances that spoke of everything they had survived and everything that was now possible. His gaze said, "You are safe." Her touch answered, "I know." His lips, when they finally met hers again, were not the desperate seeking mouth from the storm-tossed cockpit. The kiss was soft, unhurried, a tender confirmation of the promise made in the darkness. It was about feeling seen, every fractured piece of her held and cherished in his gaze. It was about the quiet joy of a sunrise after a long and terrifying night, the profound, soul-deep peace of a ship finding its harbour after a lifetime at sea. In the quiet of the cabin, with the dawn breaking over the vast, wild north, two broken souls finally and completely became whole. Their coming together was a silent conversation, a language of touch and breath and shared glances. It was about feeling safe, seen, and utterly cherished. It was the quiet joy of a sunrise after a long dark night. It was the peace of a harbour after a storm. Marley's period of exile was over. A letter had arrived on the supply plane, a formal, stilted apology from her father, an invitation to return to the world she had left behind. She was free to go. But as she stood at the window of Levi's cabin, the clean light of a new day flooding the small space, she realised that the home she had been searching for wasn't a place on a map. It wasn't a name or a status or a bank account. It was a feeling. It was the feeling of being seen, of being known, of being loved not in spite of her reckless heart, but because of it. In the vast wild north they had not run from their ghosts, but had learned to fly with them. They had navigated the storms, both external and internal, and had found their way to a quiet, sunlit shore. They had discovered that the most reckless act of all was not to fly into a storm, or to sabotage a corrupt company, but to love without reservation, to trust without fear, to build a home not of wood and nails, but of two hearts, finally and irrevocably intertwined. The Cessna engine, once a symbol of past trauma, was now the sound of a promise, a steady, reliable heartbeat in the vast, beautiful silence of the north. And the aurora, that unpredictable, breathtaking display of light and colour, was a constant reminder of the beauty that could be found in the darkest of nights, a symbol of a hope that was as wild and as untamable as the land itself. The Orchard Letters. The spring of 1947 was a season of determined hope in Northern California. The war was a scar but a healing one, and the land, indifferent to human folly, burst forth with an almost defiant splendour. In the apple orchards of the Sonoma Valley, this splendour was a palpable presence. The air, thick with the sweet, heady perfume of blossoms, hummed with the industry of bees, a sound so constant it became a part of the silence. It was a landscape of promises, of new beginnings painted in broad strokes of pink and white against the tender green of new leaves. Yet for Leah, the beauty was a quiet torment. She moved through the rows of blossoming trees like a ghost in her own life, a slender figure in a simple cotton dress that seemed too delicate for the raw red earth of the orchard. She was beautiful, with the fine-boned elegance of her Norman ancestry, but a quiet sorrow had settled in her dark eyes, a shadow that the brilliant California sun could not dispel. Her marriage to Thomas, the man who owned these trees, this earth, was one of quiet security, not passion. He was a good man, steady and kind, a silhouette she often saw in the distance, more comfortable with the rhythms of the land than the complexities of a woman's heart. He had been a soldier, a liberator, and she, a grateful war bride. Their union was a testament to survival, a practical arrangement in a world still reeling from impractical violence. But gratitude, she was learning, was a poor substitute for love. The low drone of Thomas's tractor was the relentless metronome of her days, a sound that underscored the inescapable reality of her life. It was the sound of her cage, gilded though it was with the promise of peace and plenty. On the third day of the full bloom, a new sound intruded upon the familiar drone. A sputtering, a cough, a final resigned sigh from an engine pushed beyond its endurance. A car, a dusty Ford utterly out of place on the dirt road that bordered the orchard, had broken down. The driver, a man with kind, observant eyes and a well-worn tweed jacket, emerged and stood looking at the silent engine with a philosophical resignation. He was not a farmer, that much was clear. His hands, though not soft, were stained with ink, not earth. Thomas, ever the practical Samaritan, saw the man's plight from his perch on the tractor. He drove over, the engine's rumble a stark contrast to the sudden silence of the Ford. A brief conversation, a diagnosis of a broken fan belt, and an offer of help followed. The necessary part would have to be ordered from Santa Rosa. A journey of a day, a delivery of 2 more. "You'll stay with us," Thomas said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Hospitality in the valley was as natural as the turning of the seasons. "My wife will make up the spare room." The man introducing himself as Silas, a poet travelling the country to collect the stories of those displaced and redefined by the war, accepted with a gratitude that was both genuine and graceful. Thomas, his face ruddy with sun and satisfaction, led Silas into the heart of the orchard to introduce him to his wife. Leah was thinning the blossoms on a Gravenstein tree, her movements precise and delicate, a dance of practiced necessity. "Leah," Thomas called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "This is Mr. Silas. He'll be staying with us for a few days. His car's given out the ghost." Leah turned, a stray blossom clinging to her dark hair. She brushed a strand from her forehead with the back of her hand and looked at the stranger. When her eyes met Silas's, a jolt, subtle yet profound, passed between them. It was not the spark of attraction, but something quieter, deeper, a startling flicker of recognition, the silent acknowledgement of 2 solitudes meeting in a crowded world. She extended her hand, and as he took it, the contrast was not lost on her. His fingers, though holding a writer's callus, were soft compared to the hardened, earth-stained hand of her husband. There was not a touch, but a question. My heart foolishly answered. "I've never seen blossoms like these," Silas said, his voice a warm, gentle tenor that seemed to belong to the quiet hum of the orchard. They feel hopeful, as if they are making a promise they intend to keep. Leia withdrew her hand, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. They always promise more than they deliver, she said, her French accent softening the edges of her words, a melody that Silas found himself leaning into. It is the nature of spring. Thomas, oblivious to the subtle currents passing between them, clapped his hands together. Well, the sun's high. Let's get you settled in, Mr. Silas. Leia, I'll be in for lunch in an hour. He strode off towards the house, leaving them in a silence that was suddenly charged with unspoken things. The drone of the tractor started up again, a familiar, intrusive sound, pulling Leia back to the reality of her life. But for a moment, in the quiet gaze of the poet, she had felt the whisper of another world, a world of words and feelings she had thought long lost to her. The farmhouse kitchen was a place of warmth and order, a clean, bright space that smelled of baking bread and freshly brewed coffee. It was the heart of Leia's domain, the one place where she felt a sense of purpose, of control. But in the 2 days that followed Silas's arrival, it became something more, a sanctuary of conversation, a confessional where stories, long dormant, were brought into the light. They fell into a rhythm, an easy, unforced intimacy that seemed to exist outside the bounds of her life with Thomas. While she kneaded dough, her hands dusted with flour, he would sit at the large pine table, his journal open before him, and they would talk. She told him of her home in Normandy, of the sharp, salt scent of the sea, of the grey stones of the ancient church in her village. She spoke of the war, not in the grand sweeping terms of battles and victories, but in the small personal details of fear and survival. The rumble of distant guns, the taste of fear in the back of her throat, the way the silence after a bombing was more terrifying than the noise itself. These were things she had never spoken of to Thomas, not because he wouldn't have listened, but because he couldn't have understood. He had been a soldier, a man of action, she, a witness to the slow, creeping dread of occupation. Her French accent, which in the valley marked her as an outsider, a curiosity, became in Silas's presence a thing of beauty, a cadence that lent a poetic weight to her words. In return, he read to her from his journal. They were not poems of grand passions or epic landscapes, but quiet observations of the people he had met on his travels, sketches of lives upended by the war, of hope and resilience in the face of loss. His words gave voice to the unspoken loneliness he saw in the heart of post-war America, and in doing so they gave voice to her own. He saw the world not as a series of events, but as a collection of stories, each one precious, each one worthy of being told. To speak of it, she said one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper as she watched the steam rise from her coffee cup. It makes it real again, the home I left. Perhaps it is good to be reminded of what was real. He looked at her, his gaze gentle, understanding. It's the only thing that is real, he said, the stories we carry inside us. Their awareness of each other was a constant, palpable presence, a current that flowed between them, as real and as invisible as the scent of the apple blossoms that drifted in through the open kitchen window. He watched her hands as she kneaded the bread, the sure rhythmic movement of her fingers. She watched his face as he listened to the evening birds from the porch, the way the setting sun caught the silver in his hair. They walked in the orchard, the petals falling around them like a soft, fragrant snow, their shoulders almost brushing, the space between them charged with a silent, unspoken longing. She moves with the grace of someone trying not to break the silence, he wrote in his journal, late one night, the light of a single lamp casting a golden glow on the page. I am beginning to understand that her silence is a language all its own. Thomas remained a benign, distant presence. His days were consumed by the demands of the orchard, his evenings by a quiet, exhausted sleep. He was a good man, a kind husband, and he saw nothing but a simple country hospitality in the quiet conversations between his wife and their guest. He was a man of the earth, and the subtle, unspoken language of the heart was a foreign tongue to him. On the second evening, as dusk settled over the valley, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose, they walked to the highest hill of the orchard. From there, they could see the entire valley spread out before them, a patchwork of green and gold under the vast open sky. The sound of crickets filled the air, a gentle, insistent chorus that seemed to be the soundtrack of their quiet confessions. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft with a wonder that was tinged with sadness. "Yes," he said, his eyes not on the valley, but on her face illuminated by the last fading light of day. "It is." In that moment, on that hill, with the world spread out at their feet, the unspoken thing between them was as vast and as real as the sky above. It was a connection forged in the quiet spaces between words, a bond of shared solitude that was as profound as it was impossible. On the third day the weather turned. A sudden, unseasonable storm rolled in from the coast, the sky darkening from a hopeful blue to a bruised, angry purple. The air grew heavy, electric, charged with an impending violence that mirrored the unbearable tension that had taken root in the farmhouse. The news arrived with the morning mail, a small, greasy package from the auto parts store in Santa Rosa. The fan belt. Silas announced at breakfast that he would be leaving in the morning. The words, simple and expected, hung in the air like the heavy, unfallen rain, and the easy intimacy of the past 2 days shattered. Leia felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She had known this moment was coming, had braced herself for it, but the reality of it was a physical blow. She went about her morning chores in a daze, the familiar rhythm of her life suddenly alien and meaningless. The scent of the apple blossoms, now heavy with the coming rain, seemed cloying, suffocating. That evening at dinner, the chasm between her life and her longing became a vast, unbridgeable gulf. Thomas, in a rare expansive mood, spoke of crop yields and weather patterns, of the price of apples and the threat of blight. His talk was of the earth, of the practical, tangible world he inhabited, with such simple, unquestioning certainty. It was a world of facts and figures, of seasons and cycles, a world that had no room for the poetry and feeling that had become Leia's sustenance for 2 short, miraculous days. Silas, too, seemed a stranger, his easy warmth replaced by a polite, formal distance. He spoke of his travels, of the road ahead, of the stories he had yet to collect. He was a man in motion, a bird of passage, and she, a rooted tree destined to remain in this small circumscribed world. The mundane conversation was a torment, each word a reminder of the life she was bound to, the life she had, for a brief, intoxicating moment, forgotten. Overwhelmed, she excused herself, the half-eaten food on her plate a testament to the sudden, bitter loss of appetite. She went to her room and stood at the window, watching the rain lash against the panes, blurring the world outside into a wash of grey and green. The storm hadn't yet broken, but in the electric air, her own carefully constructed composure had. She was mourning the loss of something she had never been allowed to have, a grief that felt both immense and illegitimate. How does one say goodbye to a dream that was never truly yours? The house was filled with an oppressive silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof and the distant mournful howl of the wind. Each drop that streaked down the window pane was a tear she could not shed, each gust of wind a sigh she could not release. He will leave, the blossoms will fall, and I will still be here. The thought was a cold, hard stone in her chest, a weight she knew she would carry for the rest of her days. Sleep was an impossibility. The storm outside was a pale reflection of the tempest in Leia's heart. The rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof was a maddening, relentless reminder of the passing hours, each one bringing Silas's departure and the return to her silent, passionless life closer, Unable to bear the confines of her room, the suffocating weight of her own thoughts, she rose and, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, slipped out of the house. The old barn, a cavernous space that smelled of hay and rain and the warm animal scent of horses, was her sanctuary. It was a place of quiet solitude, of simple, uncomplicated existence. She sought its familiar comfort now, a balm for her wounded spirit. The great doors were open to the night, and in the frame of their opening a silhouette stood against the storm-tossed sky. Silas. He was watching the storm, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped in a posture of weary resignation. He had not heard her approach, and for a long moment she stood in the shadows watching him, her heart aching with a love that was as hopeless as it was profound. He must have sensed her presence, for he turned, and in the dim, uncertain light their eyes met. The pretense that had held them apart for 3 days dissolved in that shared gaze. The look in his eyes held all the words they had not said, all the feelings they had not dared to acknowledge. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice a mere whisper against the sound of the storm. "Nor I," he replied, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to conceal. He took a step towards her, then another, until he was standing before her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body, see the rain clinging to his eyelashes. "In 3 days," he said, his voice low and intense, "you have made me feel more at home than I have in my entire life." The confession, so simple, so direct, undid her. The tears she had held back for so long welled in her eyes, and she could not stop them. "And you," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you have made me feel seen, truly seen, for the first time since the war." He stepped toward her and took her hand. The touch was not a prelude to passion, but a confirmation of it. He gently pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a reverence that made her tremble. "Leia," he whispered, and her name on his lips was a poem in itself. He lowered his head, and the kiss was achingly soft, a taste of rain and salt and sorrow. But the sorrow deepened into something else, a desperate, undeniable need. The kiss changed, becoming not a farewell, but a claiming of this one stolen moment. Her hands, which had rested tentatively on his chest, now gripped the rough wool of his coat, pulling him closer. He led her away from the open doors, away from the watching storm, into a quiet corner of the barn where the lantern cast a soft golden glow low on the piled hay. The world narrowed to this small sacred space, to the sound of their breathing and the rhythmic drum of rain on the tin roof. Her shawl fell from her shoulders, pooling at her feet. His coat followed, shrugged off and forgotten. There was no haste, only a deep mutual reverence, a slow, deliberate unwrapping of the layers that separated them. His fingers found the sheer lace of her nightgown, and she shivered not from cold, but from the profound intimacy of the act. The simple cotton gave way, and his hands, the hands of a poet, traced the curve of her back, learning her as if she were a verse he had longed to write. She met his touch with a quiet surrender, her own hands exploring the warm, solid plains of his chest. It was a silent conversation, a language of touch that spoke of longing, of loneliness, of a connection so deep it defied words. He lowered her gently into the sweet-smelling hay, the rough strands a stark contrast to the softness of her skin. In the flickering lantern light he looked at her, his eyes full of a tenderness that made her heart ache. This was not a taking, but a giving, a shared solace. For one night they were not a farmer's wife and a wandering poet. They were simply a man and a woman, finding in each other a brief, perfect home. Their coming together was a quiet prayer answered in the dark, a fusion of two lonely souls into a single fleeting moment of grace. It was a perfect, painful and complete memory, forged in the heart of a storm to last a lifetime. Dawn arrived, washed clean and brilliant after the storm. The air, scrubbed of its melancholy, smelled of wet earth, and the sweet bruised fragrance of the apple blossoms. Every leaf, every petal, held a single perfect drop of water that caught the morning sun and shattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Silas's departure was a study in polite, painful necessity. In the bright, unforgiving light of morning, under the watchful and knowing gaze of Thomas, they exchanged the formal, empty words of strangers, a handshake, a nod, a final fleeting glance that held a universe of unspoken things, and then he was gone. He got into his car, the engine turning over with a new healthy roar, and drove away without looking back. Leia watched until the car was a mere speck of dust on the horizon, the scent of wet blossoms clinging to the air like a final fading kiss. Decades later, the scent of old paper and dried ink filled the sun-drenched attic of the farmhouse. Claire, Leia's granddaughter, a young woman with her grandmother's dark, thoughtful eyes, knelt on the dusty floorboards, a small wooden chest open before her. The house was empty now, Leia and Thomas long gone, the orchard sold to a neighbouring vineyard. Claire had come to sort through the remnants of their lives, the tangible echoes of a past she had only known through stories. Inside the chest, tied with a faded blue ribbon, was a stack of letters. They were written on thin, airmail paper, the ink faded to a soft sepia brown. The handwriting was elegant, sloping, the words a beautiful, precise script. They were addressed not to a person, but to a place, a memory, to the one I couldn't have. Claire, her heart pounding with a sudden inexplicable sense of discovery, opened the first letter. It was from Silas, dated a week after he had left the orchard. She read his words, his voice echoing across the decades, and the secret heart of her grandmother, a woman she had known only as a quiet, gentle presence, was laid bare. The final intimacy between Leia and Silas was not physical but textual, a communion across time, witnessed at last by the one person who could understand its profound and silent beauty. Claire read the letters one after another, a testament to a love that had existed outside of time and circumstance, a love that had been kept alive in the quiet, secret spaces of the heart. He wrote to Leia of his travels, of the people he met, the stories he collected. But always he circled back to their 3 days in the orchard, to the scent of the blossoms, the sound of her voice, the quiet, profound connection that had redefined his world. He wrote of seeing a woman with her hair, of hearing a laugh that reminded him of hers, of the way the world in its vast and varied beauty was but a pale reflection of the beauty he had found in her. The letters were a testament to an enduring private devotion, a love that had asked for nothing and had been given everything. The final letter, written 40 years later, was penned in the wavering, uncertain hand of an old man. His memory, he wrote, was failing him, the edges of his life blurring into a soft, indistinct haze. But the image of her in the orchard, surrounded by blossoms, her face illuminated by the setting sun, remained as clear and as vivid as the day he had left. It was the one true and unchanging thing in a life of constant motion, the still point in his turning world. Claire, her own eyes now filled with tears, looked out the attic window at the neat, orderly rows of grapevines that had replaced the wild, untamed beauty of the apple orchard. She thought of her grandmother, of the quiet, unspoken sorrow she had sometimes glimpsed in her eyes, and she understood. Some loves are not meant for a lifetime, they are meant for a moment, and in that moment they give us a lifetime of meaning. The orchard was gone, but the letters remained, a legacy of unspoken passion, a testament to the quiet rebellions of the heart and the loves we keep alive in silence. The Hickory Hammer and the Rose. The men of Blackwood Gulch emerged from the earth as if born from it, their faces masks of soot, Their shoulders stooped with the memory of low ceilings and the weight of the hills. Jack was one of them, 18 years old, but with the ancient weariness of a miner already settling into the lines around his eyes. He surfaced with the others at the end of the shift, the cage rattling its ascent into the grey, coal-dusted air of the Pennsylvania afternoon. The darkness, he often thought, wasn't just the dust in a man's lungs. It was a quiet that settled in the soul, a permanent twilight that the sun could pierce but never fully dispel. His life was a rhythm of darkness and dim light, of the mind's dangerous embrace and the meagre comforts of a shack shared with a silent, exhausted father and 2 younger brothers who were already learning the shape of a pickaxe. But today, a different sound cut through the familiar clank and grind of the colliery. It was the whisper of hope. As he washed the worst of the grime from his face and hands at the communal pump, he overheard 2 older miners, their voices rough with coal dust and cynicism, talking about the Blackwood diamonds. "Another season," one grumbled. "Another chance for Harrington to make us think he's a benevolent soul giving us a ball field." "It's a bit of sun though, ain't it?" said the other. "Better than the black damp." For them it was a pastime, a brief distraction. For Jack the idea of it was a prayer. To stand in the full unapologetic sun, to feel the warmth on his skin, to swing a bat instead of a pick, it felt like a pardon. He had a secret strength, a power that coiled in his arms and shoulders, born of swinging a sledge in the tight seams of the earth. It was a brutal, punishing strength, but he wondered, with a flicker of yearning, if it could be shaped into something else, something like grace. That evening, by the light of a single kerosene lamp, he took the piece of hickory he had been seasoning for months. It was a stout limb, dense and heavy. He had worked on it in stolen moments, shaving it down with a draw knife, smoothing it with a shard of glass until it felt balanced and alive in his hands. It was rough-hewn, imperfect, but it was his. The day of the tryouts, the company baseball field was an impossible emerald island in a sea of grey slag and soot. The grass, meticulously tended by order of the mine owner, smelled sharp and sweet, a scent of life in a town that smelled of slow death. Jack stood at the edge of the field, clutching his hickory bat, feeling the eyes of the other men on his worn clothes and his quiet demeanour. The team captain, a burly foreman named Silas Croft, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Jack's worn boots. "What's this, then?" Croft scoffed, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Another pit rat thinks he can play ball?" The men around him chuckled. Jack said nothing. His silence was often mistaken for slowness, but it was the quiet of a man who had learned that words were a currency he could not afford. "Give the lad a swing, Si," another man called out, more out of a desire for diversion than kindness. Croft shrugged. "All right, boy, let's see what you got. Don't break your fancy stick." Jack walked to the packed dirt that served as home plate. The pitcher, a lanky fellow with a mocking grin, wound up and threw. The ball came at him, a white blur against the weary sky. Jack's world narrowed to that single point of motion. He swung, not with the frenzied energy of the other men, but with a fluid, powerful turn of his hips and shoulders, the same motion he used to break coal from the earth. The sound was not a crack, but a thunderclap, a clean, resonant boom that echoed across the field and silenced the mockery. Every head turned, not to him, but to the sky, following the impossible flight of the ball. It soared, a white speck climbing against the vast, indifferent blue, carrying with it the weight of 1,000 sunless hours. It landed far beyond the outfield, in the rough grasses that bordered the slag heaps. A stunned silence fell over the field, then a slow murmur of appreciation. Croft stared, his mouth agape, a string of tobacco juice forgotten on his chin. Jack just stood there, his heart pounding not with pride, but with a strange, unfamiliar lightness. He had made the team. It was in that moment of suspended time that he saw her. She was watching from the shade of a parasol near her father's gleaming motorcar, a figure of impossible delicacy in this coarse world. Clara Harrington, the mine owner's daughter. She was meant to be above this rough entertainment, a rose in a walled garden, but her eyes were fixed on the field, on him. She was drawn, not to the spectacle, but to the raw, untutored grace of the new player. For a fleeting, charged second, their eyes met across the expanse of green. He saw curiosity in her gaze, a flicker of something more, something that was not pity. He looked away at once, a hot flush of shame and awe rising under his skin, the coal dust on his cheek suddenly feeling like a brand. He was a miner. She was a Harrington. The distance between them was not measured in yards, but in generations of wealth and privilege, a chasm as deep and dark as the mine shaft itself. Later, as she was driven away, Clara turned to her companion, a girl whose chatter had been a meaningless hum in the background. "Did you see that?" Clara's voice was soft, almost breathless. It wasn't just strength, it was like music. And Jack, walking home with his hickory bat resting on his shoulder, carried the memory of her gaze like a secret ember. The sun on that field had felt like a pardon, but the brief meeting of their eyes felt like a promise of a world he had never dared to imagine. Summer settled over Blackwood Gulch, laying a soft, secretive haze over the harsh angles of the town. The evenings grew long and warm, and the air, for a few precious hours after the day's work was done, seemed to hold the scent of something other than coal. The wild roses that tangled over the fences, the damp earth by the creek. Jack's life had found a new rhythm. By day, he was still a creature of the dark, his body and soul given over to the mine. But in the evenings and on weekends, he was the slugger of the Blackwood Diamonds, a local hero. The thunderous crack of his hickory bat became a sound of civic pride, a weekly miracle that lifted, for a few hours, the oppressive weight of the town's existence. He was no longer just another anonymous miner, he was their star, the boy who could send a baseball into another county. Yet the praise, the slaps on the back from men who had once scoffed at him, only made him more acutely aware of his other deficiencies. The more they saw his strength, the more he felt his own tediance, his own ignorance. The 4th of July town picnic was a rare occasion when the rigid strata of Blackwood society softened at the edges. The miners and their families gathered on one side of the town green, the merchants and managers on the other. But the space between was filled with the sounds of children's games and the shared smoke of roasting meat. Clara, in a dress the colour of a summer sky, deliberately broke from her circle of polite, chattering friends and walked across that invisible line. She found Jack sitting alone on a log, awkwardly holding a plate of food. He stood up at her approach, his movements clumsy with surprise. "Mr..." he started, then stopped, realising he didn't know her last name, only that it was the same as the one on the mine's entrance. "Harrington," she supplied, with a smile that was meant to put him at ease. "I wanted to tell you how much I enjoy watching you play. You have a remarkable talent." He fumbled for words, his tongue thick and unpractised. "Thank you, miss. I just swing the bat." "It's more than that," she said, her gaze direct and serious. "It's the way you stand, the way you move. It's like you were born to do it." He could only look at her, his heart a clumsy drum in his chest. He had never been this close to such a creature, all rosewater perfume and starched linen. He saw past the fine dress, though, to the genuine kindness in her eyes. She saw past his rough clothes and soot-stained hands to the earnest, gentle soul within. That brief public conversation was the beginning of their secret rituals. They began to meet in the twilight by the creek that served as the town's unofficial boundary, separating the miners' shacks from the more prosperous houses. In the soft, fading light, with the first fireflies blinking like shared secrets, they talked. He told her of the crushing weight of the mine, the constant fear that was a miner's companion, the way the darkness seeped into a man's bones. She in turn spoke of the crushing weight of expectation, of a life laid out like a formal garden, beautiful but without freedom. One evening she brought a book with her. It was a slim volume of poetry, Whitman. She opened it, the pages rustling in the quiet air. "May I read something to you?" she asked. He looked at the printed words, a jumble of black marks that held a world of meaning he could not access. The shame he'd carried for a lifetime, a secret burden heavier than any load of coal, rose in his throat. "I can't read," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. He expected her to recoil, to see him finally for what he was, an ignorant boy, a creature of the dark. But Clara did not recoil. She looked at him, and her expression was one of profound, aching compassion. "Then I will read to you," she said softly. And she did. Her voice, clear and steady, became his bridge to a world of beauty and ideas he had never known existed. She read of the open road, of the kinship of all living things, of the body electric. The words, shaped by her voice, were not just sounds, they were colours, textures, emotions that filled the empty spaces in his soul. This act of reading aloud became their most profound intimacy, a bond of mind and spirit that was deeper and more thrilling than any physical touch. He would sit, his hands resting on his knees, and watch her face in the gathering dusk, her features softened, her eyes alive with the passion of the words. He began to see the world not just as a place of toil and sorrow, but as a place of wonder, of poetry. "When you read," he told her one evening, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "it's like you're opening a window in a room I never knew was locked." She closed the book and looked at him, the last light of the day catching the tenderness in her eyes. The scent of her rosewater perfume mingled with the earthy smell of the creek, a fragrance he would forever associate with hope. In her own quiet moments, alone in her grand silent house, Clara would think of him, her father, a man who saw the world in terms of profit and loss, saw only a simple miner, a cog in his vast machine. But she saw a soul starved for light, and she thought, with a fierce protective certainty, how can it be wrong to offer it? The summer's gentle intimacy could not last. It was a fragile bloom in a world of iron and coal, and soon the forces of that world conspired to crush it. The first blow came not from the clang of machinery, but from the rustle of silk and the whisper of gossip. A town is a small place, and secrets like fireflies cannot stay hidden in the dark for long. The news of their clandestine meetings reached the ears of Mr. Harrington, delivered by a town gossip with the self-righteous satisfaction of one performing a civic duty. Harrington, a man whose heart had long ago been calcified by the pursuit of wealth and power, was a formidable force. He summoned Jack to his study, a room that was a fortress of his own making. The walls were lined with more books than Jack had ever seen in one place, their leather spines gleaming like the shields of a silent, intimidating army. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of cigar smoke and old leather, the smell of power. Harrington did not waste time with pleasantries. He sat behind a massive desk, a small, hard man in a large, imposing chair, and his eyes were like chips of granite. "I am told," he began, his voice cold and precise, "that you have been meeting my daughter." Jack stood before him, his hands, calloused and stained, hanging uselessly at his sides. He felt the familiar weight of the mine, the feeling of being trapped in a narrow, airless space. "Yes, sir," he said. Harrington's attack was merciless. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. His words were small, sharp instruments designed to inflict maximum pain. He spoke of Jack's poverty, of the squalor of the miners' shacks, of the inherent inferiority of his class, but his cruelest blows were aimed at Jack's most vulnerable point. "My daughter reads Chaucer," Harrington said, his voice dripping with contempt. "She discusses philosophy. You, I am told, cannot read a street sign. You're an ignorant boy, unfit to speak her name, let alone stand in her presence." You will not drag her down into your darkness. Each word was a lash, stripping away the fragile sense of worth that Clara's kindness had begun to build in him. He stood there, silent and bleeding, as Harrington forbade him from ever seeing Clara again. He was dismissed like a disobedient servant, a piece of faulty machinery to be discarded. As this emotional storm raged in the suffocating quiet of the Harrington mansion, another, quieter event was unfolding on the sun-drenched baseball field. A man sat alone in the bleachers, a world-weary figure in a dusty suit. He was a scout for the Philadelphia Athletics, a man whose job it was to find raw, unpolished diamonds in the rough. He had followed a tip, a whisper of a boy in a coal town who could hit a ball a country mile. He watched Jack play, and he saw not a minor, not an ignorant boy, but pure, undeniable talent. He saw the fluid power, the instinctive grace, the way the hickory bat seemed an extension of Jack's own body. He saw Jack hit 3 baseballs so far, with such effortless force that they seemed to defy the laws of physics. He saw something more valuable than the strong arm. He saw a swing that could win pennants. After the game, the scout approached Jack. He spoke in a quiet, business-like tone, but his words were a lifeline. He offered Jack a contract, a piece of paper that represented a fortune, a new life, a way out of the mines forever. It was a world away in Philadelphia, a city of unimaginable size and complexity. Jack held the flimsy paper in his hands, the ink a stark black against the white. It felt unreal, a dream from which he would soon awaken to the familiar darkness of the mine. He was faced with an impossible choice. He could stay and fight for a love that was now more than ever doomed. Or he could leave, and in leaving, perhaps become the man he believed Clara deserved, a man worthy of her love. That night, they met one last time by the creek. The air was cool, hinting at the coming of autumn. The fireflies were gone. Clara had been crying, her face pale and strained in the moonlight. He told her everything, the confrontation with her father, the scout, the contract. "He thinks I'm nothing because I can't read his books," Jack said, his voice rough with a pain that was deeper than any physical blow. "Maybe he's right. But this contract, maybe it's a way I can write my own story." Clara looked at him, her heart aching with a love that was now tangled with sorrow and a fierce protective anger. She knew what he had to do. She knew that to ask him to stay would be to condemn him to the darkness her father had so cruelly described. The mournful whistle of a distant train cut through the night, a sound that symbolized both escape and departure, a future that was both a promise and a heartbreak. Philadelphia was a raw, a relentless, overwhelming symphony of noise and motion that was a world away from the weary quiet of Blackwood Gulch. Jack, now rechristened by the sports writers as the Hickory Hammer, or the Minor Marvel, was an immediate sensation. His hitting was a force of nature, a raw, untamed power that the league had never seen. The crack of his bat was the sound of a new legend being born, and the crowds roared his name. But off the field, he was a ghost. He lived in a small, anonymous boarding house, and the city was a labyrinth he could not navigate. He learned his way by landmarks, a tall church steeple, a bridge over the Schuylkill, a particular pattern of bricks on a street corner. He could not read the street signs, the menus in the cheap diners, the headlines that screamed his own name from the newsstands. His fame was a constant glaring reminder of his secret inadequacy, the gilded cage of his own making. Back in Blackwood, Clara was living in a cage of a different sort. Her father's cold fury was a palpable presence in the house, a suffocating silence that was more oppressive than any shouted words. He controlled her movements, her correspondence, her very existence, determined to break her spirit, to mould her back into the dutiful, ornamental daughter he believed she should be. For weeks she endured it, her grief and longing, a silent, secret rebellion. But there is a point at which a spirit, no matter how gentle, will break or break free. One sweltering late summer morning, Clara reached that point. She packed a small bag, left a note on her pillow, a note her father would read with a rage that would be, for the first time, impotent, and took a train to Philadelphia. She found him at his boarding house, a tired, lonely figure in a city that celebrated his name but did not know his soul. The sight of her on his doorstep, her face pale but resolute, undid him. All the fear, the loneliness, the aching, desperate longing of the past month spilled over. He pulled her inside, his hands gripping her arms as if to assure himself that she was real, and the dam of their restraint, so carefully constructed, so painfully maintained, finally broke. The scene began with a desperate, breathless kiss that was more about collision than tenderness, a reunion that tasted of tears and train smoke. He kissed her like he was breathing her in, each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest that had been his constant companion since he'd left. His large, calloused hands, so used to the rough, unyielding hickory of a bat, traced her back with a hesitant reverence, drawing shivers that left her breathless. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of longing. Clothes fell away, a clumsy, urgent shedding of the barriers that had kept them apart. Skin met skin in a heated rush that stole their breath. It was a physical consummation of every stolen glance across a baseball field, every poem read aloud in the twilight, a silent promise finally desperately kept. His hands, which had known only the harshness of coal and the solid impact of a baseball, learned a new language on her skin, a language of softness and surrender. The world dissolved into sensation and feeling, a physical manifestation of the words she had read to him, the worlds she had opened for him. It was a raw, elemental act, stripped of all artifice, a pure expression of a love that had been forged in the unlikely crucible of a coal town. Afterwards, they lay in the narrow bed, the sounds of the city a distant, meaningless hum. He held her, his arms a safe harbour in the storm of their emotions. "I didn't know a man could feel this. Clean," he whispered against her hair, his voice rough with an emotion he had never before allowed himself to feel. "Like you washed all the coal dust right out of my soul." Clara held him tighter, her own heart full of a fierce, triumphant love. Here, she thought, in this small plain room, with his arms around me, is the only real home I have ever known. Let father have his mansion, I have my kingdom here. The profound quiet that followed the storm of their reunion was not an emptiness, but a space filled with the silent, certain knowledge that they had found their way back to each other, that they had, against all odds, written the beginning of their own story. The morning sun, filtering through the grimy window of the Philadelphia boarding house, illuminated a new beginning. As the city awoke to its daily clamour, a quiet promise was made in the small, cluttered room. Jack, his voice thick with a humility that was born not of shame but of love, made a vow. He asked Clara to teach him to read. Their days fell into a new, sacred ritual. In the mornings he went to the ballpark, his body given over to the familiar, satisfying rhythm of practice. He was the hickory hammer, a creature of instinct and power. But in the afternoons he became a different kind of student, his large, calloused hands, so adept at gripping a bat, now struggling to hold a pen, to shape the clumsy, unfamiliar letters. His bat and his books now sat side by side, symbols of the two halves of himself that were, at last, coming together. Clara was a patient and gentle teacher. She saw not the slow, halting progress, but the fierce determination in his eyes. She understood that each word he learned to decipher was a victory, a small act of rebellion against the darkness that had defined his life. Their lessons were not just about reading, they were about building a shared world, a world where he was not just her protector, but her partner, After months of patient, painstaking work, Jack wrote his first letter. It was short, the handwriting clumsy, the spelling uncertain, but the words were a testament to a love that had found its voice. He slid the piece of paper across the table to her, his face a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. He read, "My dearest Clara, will you marry me? I can write your name now. I can love you right. Yours, Jack." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, her heart full of a love that was deeper and more profound than she had ever imagined possible. They were married quietly, without fanfare, in a small church with only a few of his teammates as witnesses. That autumn, Jack led his team to the World Series. He was no longer just a slugger. He was a hero, his story a source of inspiration for a nation that loved tales of improbable triumph. The newspapers, which had once sensationalized his illiteracy, now wrote of his quiet dignity, his dedication, and his beautiful, well-read wife. Mr. Harrington, in his grand, lonely house in Blackwood Gulch, read those stories. He saw the photographs of his daughter, her face radiant with a happiness he had never been able to give her. Pride, or perhaps some long-dormant flicker of fatherly love, warred with his anger. He travelled to Philadelphia for the final game of the series. He sat in the stands, a small, anonymous figure in the roaring crowd, and he watched the man he had once dismissed as an ignorant boy. He saw not just the power of Jack's swing, but the quiet confidence with which he carried himself. After the game, as the crowd celebrated the victory, Harrington saw Jack approached by a young boy holding out a baseball and a pen. He watched as Jack took the ball and, with a slow, careful concentration, signed his own name, carefully forming the letters. Later, amidst the chaos of the locker room, Harrington approached them. There was no grand apology, no admission of his own blindness. There was only a quiet, grudging acknowledgement of a truth he could no longer deny. He extended his hand to Jack. "You have made her happy," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "That is all a father can ask." The handshake was a treaty, a quiet end to a long and bitter war. That night, in their small, sunlit apartment, the celebration was private and profound. The roar of the crowd was a distant memory, replaced by the quiet peace of their shared life. Clara lay in bed, watching Jack as he sat in a chair by the lamplight, a newspaper spread across his lap. He was reading aloud, his voice slow but steady, the words no longer a barrier but a bridge between them. He put the paper down and came to her. This embrace was different from their first desperate, hungry reunion. It was slow, sure, and deeply peaceful, a dance of equals. It was a celebration not of a victory on a baseball field, but of the quiet, hard-won triumph of their love. Every touch was a word, every kiss a sentence in the story they had written together. The comfortable weight of her head on his shoulder, the gleam of a simple gold wedding band on his finger. These were the symbols of a love that had found its own language, a language that transcended the written word. And so, the boy who came out of the darkness learned that a man's worth is not measured by the station of his birth, but by the reach of his heart, and that the most beautiful words are not the ones found in books, but the ones you learn to write on another's soul. Before the visa expires. The air in Soho that October afternoon was a specific kind of New York magic, crisp enough to feel alive in your lungs, yet warmed by a sun that slanted between the cast-iron giants, turning the city to gold. It was a season of breathtaking beauty and inherent melancholy, a final vibrant gasp before the grey sleep of winter. It was a season for endings, and for beginnings that felt dangerously like them. Leo, at 29, believed in the integrity of lines. As an architect, his world was one of blueprints, of 90-degree angles and the unimpeachable logic of load-bearing walls. Yet his secret soul belonged to the graphite pencil in his hand. He wasn't drafting, he was sketching. On a thick, textured sheet, he was capturing the skeleton of an old building on Green Street. The proud Corinthian columns, the elegant arch of the windows, the precise geometry that had outlasted a century. He was so lost in the conversation between his eyes and his hand that he didn't immediately notice the explosion of colour just 20 feet away. When he finally looked up, blinking, he saw her. She was a storm of defiant energy against the city's grid. A young woman, surely no older than her early 20s, would stood before a large canvas, not painting the building he was so carefully rendering, but its very soul. Her brush strokes were chaotic, impassioned slashes of ochre, cerulean, and a defiant, furious red. Where he saw structure, she saw feeling. Where he drew lines, she painted breath. This was Amélie. She felt his gaze before she saw it, a sudden stillness in the air. She turned, a smudge of cobalt blue on her cheek, her eyes a deep, inquisitive brown. They held a spark of a challenge, as if daring him to question her interpretation of the world. He found himself walking towards her, an unconscious pull. "You've missed a window," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She glanced from her riotous canvas to the building, then back to his meticulously detailed sketchpad. A slow smile spread across her lips. "And you," she replied, her French accent turning the words into music, "have missed the entire point." He felt a laugh escape him, a genuine, uncalculated sound. "The point being?" "The feeling," she said, gesturing with her brush as if it were a conductor's baton. "This building, it is not just stone and glass. It is proud, you see, a little lonely. It remembers horses, and now it watches taxis. It is everything at once. You draw its bones, I paint its breath." He was captivated. Her words articulated a truth he'd only ever felt, a truth he tried to bury under the comforting weight of practicality. He looked from his precise drawing to her vibrant painting, and felt a sudden sharp pang of something like envy, or perhaps recognition. "I wonder," Amélie mused, her eyes crinkling at the corners, "how hard my heart is breathing right now." The words were a soft confession, meant only for herself, but the wind carried them to him. "I think I can," he said, and the honesty of it surprised them both. "You don't just look at things, you inhale them. It's terrifying and wonderful." He bought her a coffee from a nearby cart, ostensibly to warm her hands, which were stained with the sharp metallic scent of oil paint. They stood there for hours, a small bubble of warmth against the city's magnificent chill, as the golden light deepened to bruised purple. He spoke of plans and certainties. She spoke of moments and maybes. It was a conversation between French romanticism and American pragmatism, and in the space between, something new was being built. A week later, they stood on the Brooklyn Bridge. The sun had set and the city across the river had lit up, a sprawling galaxy laid out just for them. Their week had been a whirlwind of discovery, not of tourist traps, but of the city's hidden poetry, a forgotten garden in the village, the echoing silence of Grand Central late at night, the taste of cannoli from a tiny shop in Carroll Gardens. They had shared stories, silences, and the easy intimacy of people who feel they have known each other for a lifetime. It was there, suspended between two boroughs, with the distant moan of a ferry horn rising from the East River, that the shadow finally fell. "Weeks," Amélie said softly, her gaze fixed on the skyline. Leo knew what she meant, her student visa. The words hung in the cold air, a tangible thing, a wall being erected between them. The future, which had felt infinite just a moment before, suddenly had a brutal, non-negotiable deadline. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the same fear that was coiling in his own stomach. He saw this vibrant, beautiful force of nature being reduced to a number on a form, a departure date on a ticket. Before he could offer some useless, practical platitude, she turned to him. Her expression was fierce, desperate, and then, to defy the clock, to stop the world from spinning towards that inevitable goodbye. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't a gentle, exploratory kiss. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated will. It was hungry and deep, a desperate act of possession, as if she could anchor herself to him, to this city, to this single perfect moment. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her jaw, and he kissed her back with all the unspoken longing that had been building inside him. It was a kiss that tasted of cold air, warm coffee, and the impossible, heartbreaking hope that they could somehow stop time itself. 3 weeks later, the shadow had grown into a suffocating blanket. Leo found Amelie in her dorm room at her Pratt. Her vibrant energy dimmed, her face pale. She wasn't painting. A half-packed suitcase lay open on her bed like a wound. The brilliant colours of her canvases, stacked against the wall, seemed to mock the grey finality of her situation. She was crying, not with loud sobs, but with a silent, steady grief that was far more devastating. "It is just paper," she whispered, looking at a printed itinerary on her desk. "My whole life here, everything I feel, and it is ended by a piece of paper." Leo looked at her, at the crushing weight of bureaucracy pressing down on this beautiful free spirit. All his life he had followed blueprints, respected boundaries, adhered to the rules. In that moment, watching her spirit crumble, he realized that some rules were meant to be broken, some boundaries were meant to be crossed. "Let's not say goodbye in an airport," he said, the words coming out in a rush of beautiful, breathtaking madness. An airport is the least romantic place on earth. It's a place of endings. Let's not end. Let's just drive. Her tear-filled eyes widened. Drive? Drive where? "West," he said, the idea taking shape as he spoke it. "Away from airports, towards the horizon. We'll just drive until our time runs out." It was an insane proposition. It was illogical, impractical, and had no endgame. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said. A flicker of the old fire returned to her eyes. "You are serious." "I've never been more serious." The next morning they were in a borrowed, beat-up convertible, a single bag each in the back, the skyline of New York shrinking in the rearview mirror. They had no map, only a shared, worn-out road atlas and a pact to take turns choosing the direction at every major fork. They were running away from a deadline, creating a pocket of stolen time, a kingdom of two on the open road. The world expanded. The city's grey canyons gave way to the rolling green hills of Pennsylvania, then the wide, flat plains of the Midwest. The air changed, smelling of soil and sky. They subsisted on cheap diner coffee that tasted of hope and talked for hours, the wind whipping through their hair, snatching their words and scattering them across the vast American landscape. One night, somewhere in the stark, magnificent emptiness of the Arizona desert, a tire blew. They were stranded, miles from the nearest town under an ocean of stars so bright it felt like you could drown in them. The silence was immense, broken only by the chirping of crickets. They lay on the hood of the car, the metal still warm from the day's sun. It was here, under that silent, witnessing sky, that the carefully constructed walls of their public selves came down. "All my life has been about blueprints and certainties," Leo confessed, his voice quiet against the vastness. "My father was an engineer. Everything had a purpose, a plan. I was supposed to join a big firm, design skyscrapers, be sensible." He paused. "My secret dream, the one I never told anyone, was just to build one small, perfect house for me. A place that wasn't about angles, but about light. A place that felt like peace. He looked at her, his silhouette outlined by starlight. I buried that dream under so much practicality, I almost forgot it was there. Amélie reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. In France, she said, her voice thick with emotion. My life is a painting that is already sketched for me. My family has a gallery. I am to work there, marry a sensible man from a good family, continue the legacy. She took a shaky breath. I came to New York to escape it, to see if my own paintings, the ones from inside me, were any good. But I am so afraid they are not. I am afraid this passion is just a thing of my youth, that it will fade, and I will become that sensible woman in that sensible life after all. He squeezed her hand. Never, he said, the word a vow. Your passion is the most real thing I've ever seen. They didn't speak for a long time after that, simply holding hands and staring up at the cosmos, two fragile souls sharing their deepest fears in the heart of nowhere. A few days later, they were caught in a sudden, violent thunderstorm in a small town of Colorado. The sky broke open, drenching them in seconds. Laughing, they ran for the nearest shelter, a dusty, time-forgotten motel with a flickering neon sign. The room smelled of old wood, rain, and lemon polish. It was a space outside of time, anonymous and safe. The promise to figure it out felt fragile here, but also deeply real. Drenched and shivering, they stood in the middle of the room, the sound of the storm a wild drumbeat outside. He reached out and gently brushed a stray wet strand of hair from her cheek. He traced the map of her face with his finger, the curve of her eyebrow, the line of her nose, the soft bow of her lips, as if memorizing it for a future he couldn't yet see. She took his hand in hers, turning it over and studying the lines of his palm, pressing a kiss to its centre. In France, my life is a painting that is already sketched for me, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. With you, I feel like I'm holding the brush for the first time. He drew her closer, his heart aching with a tenderness so profound it almost hurt. The damp chill of their clothes was nothing against the heat blooming between them. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate time-stopping kiss from the bridge, but something far more intimate. A slow, deep discovery that tasted of rain and trust. The kiss deepened, becoming a silent conversation full of the confessions they had shared under the stars. His hand slid from her face to her back, pulling her flush against him until he could feel the frantic, beautiful beat of her heart against his own. She sighed into his mouth, a sound of pure surrender, and her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his damp hair. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the rain, the dim light of the single lamp, and the consuming intimacy that felt both thrilling and deeply peaceful. With a gentle, unspoken accord, he led her the few steps to the edge of the bed, their lips never parting. The frantic energy of their escape had finally given way to a quiet, reverent need. He eased the damp jacket from her shoulders, his movements slow and deliberate. She, in turn, began to unbutton his shirt, her fingers brushing against his skin. It was not a rush of passion, but an act of profound vulnerability, a quiet shedding of the world outside and the fears they had carried. Each layer removed was a wall coming down, until there was nothing left between them but the warm, dim light and a breathtaking sense of trust. Lying beside her, he traced the line of her shoulder, his touch gentle as if he were seeing her for the very first time. In this anonymous room, in the heart of a storm, they were more themselves than they had ever been. When they finally came together, it was a slow, perfect union, a feeling of shelter, of two lost travellers finding their way home in each other. It was a silent language of skin and breath, a quiet rhythm that matched the rain on the roof, washing away every last trace of loneliness. In the heart of the storm, they had created their own perfect peace. The bubble didn't just burst. It was brutally shattered under the cold, unforgiving fluorescent lights of Los Angeles International Airport. They had pushed their luck, stealing one more week, a blissful, ignorant 7 days on the California coast, pretending the calendar didn't exist. But the calendar was merciless. When Amelie tried to check in for her flight, her 1 week overstay on her visa flagged an immediate alert. A stern, uniformed officer led her to a small, sterile room. Leo was forced to wait outside, his frantic questions meeting a wall of bureaucratic indifference. The scene was cold, clinical, and utterly devastating. Through a small glass window he saw Amelie's face, pale and stricken, as she was told in flat, impersonal terms that she was being denied re-entry, not just now, but for the foreseeable future. There would be a mark on her record. Future travel would be complicated. They were torn apart not by a dramatic, tearful goodbye at a departure gate, but by a man with a stamp and a rule book. The last time he saw her, she was being escorted towards her plane, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The vibrant, defiant artist was gone, replaced by a heartbroken girl, swallowed by a system neither of them could fight. The aching distance set in almost immediately, a chasm far wider than the 9-hour time difference. Their lives, once so beautifully intertwined, were now relegated to the blue light of screens. Leo was back in his minimalist New York apartment, which now felt cavernous and empty. Amelie was in her cramped childhood bedroom in Lyon, a place that felt like a museum of a life she had outgrown. Their conversations became logistical nightmares. Is it too late to call? Did I wake you? The easy intimacy they had shared was fractured by lagging video and the frustrating digital echo of their own voices. The vibrant connection that had sparked over a shared glance and flourished on the open road began to fray under the strain of thousands of miles of cable. Leo, a man of action, threw himself at the problem. His desk became a chaotic landscape of immigration forms, legal statutes, and visa application guides. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers whose retainers drained his savings, each conversation ending with the same cautious, non-committal advice. These things take time. There are no guarantees. He tried to explain the complexities to Amelie, but over the poor connection, his focused frustration sounded like cold detachment. "I'm doing everything I can, Amelie," he said one night, his voice strained with exhaustion. "But I can't fight a government with a road trip map and good intentions." To Amelie, helpless on the other side of the world, it felt like he was fighting a problem, not fighting for her. She couldn't see the piles of paperwork. She could only feel the growing distance. He was still in their city, walking streets they had walked together. She was trapped in the past, watching him pack up her New York life into boxes over FaceTime, each item a book, a scarf, a half-used tube of paint, a fresh stab of loss. After one particularly bad call filled with static and dropped words, she collapsed onto her bed sobbing. "He doesn't understand," she whispered to the empty room. "He is still there. I am in a museum of my own life, looking at a past I can no longer touch." The seeds of doubt planted in the fertile ground of fear and distance began to sprout. One evening, Leo mentioned getting a drink with a female colleague, an immigration paralegal who was offering advice off the clock. In the lonely silence of her Lyon night, Amelie's imagination, once a source of beautiful art, now conjured torturous images of this competent, helpful New York woman. A few days later, trying to force a sense of normalcy, Amelie had dinner with an old friend from art school in Lyon. When she spoke to Leo afterward, he heard the faint sound of male laughter in the background of the cafe. His own insecurities, raw from the feeling of helplessness, flared into a sharp, ugly jealousy. The suspicion was a poison. Their calls became shorter, more cautious. The silences grew longer, filled not with comfortable intimacy, but with unspoken accusations. The worn-out road atlas, once a symbol of their freedom, now seemed like a naive relic of a time when they believed love could conquer anything. They had crossed a continent together, only to find themselves stranded on opposite sides of an ocean of doubt. The scent of her perfume lingering on a scarf he'd kept was no longer a comfort, but a painful reminder of everything he was losing. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, or perhaps it was a Wednesday for Amelie. Time had become a blur of exhaustion and disappointment. Another visa application had been rejected, the official language colder and more final than the last. The legal fees were mounting into a mountain of debt. Leo was staring at his laptop screen, feeling the full weight of his failure. He was an architect who couldn't build a bridge between them. Amelie's face on the screen was a portrait of sorrow. She looked tired, her vibrant light dimmed to a flicker. "Leo," she began, her voice fragile, Maybe we must be realistic." The word realistic struck him like a physical blow. It was the antithesis of everything they had been. It was the language of his old life, the sensible, practical world he had so joyfully escaped. "Maybe this is too much," she continued, tears welling in her eyes. "I cannot ask you to do this, to spend all this money, all this life. I feel like a burden to you. Perhaps it's better if we just let go." The words hung in the digital space between them, a tragedy wrapped in the guise of kindness. Letting go, the sensible thing, the end. An abyss opened up in Leo's chest. He could feel her slipping away, could feel the thousands of miles between them hardening into a permanent reality. He could agree, he could be realistic. He could let the beautiful, impossible chaos of her slip through his fingers and return to his world of straight lines and predictable outcomes. But the thought was unbearable. Instead of answering, he did something entirely unexpected. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and turned his laptop around. The wall behind his desk was no longer a blank, minimalist white. It was covered, from floor to ceiling, with him, with them. Dozens of sketches, rendered in his precise soulful graphite, papered the entire surface. There she was, her face turned to the sun on that first day in Soho. There she was, asleep in the passenger seat of the convertible, her expression peaceful and unguarded. There she was, her face illuminated by the glow of a campfire in the desert, her eyes full of wonder. He had drawn every moment, every expression, hoarding the memories on paper. In the centre of the wall of sketches, on a small table, sat a scale model. It wasn't a skyscraper, it was a house, a small, beautiful, modern house with wide glass walls and a roof that seemed to float. It was elegant and simple, a structure designed not for a city block but for a clearing in the woods, a place where light and nature could pour in. He sat back down, his face now illuminated by the glow of his own testament. "Do you see this?" he asked, his voice cracking with an emotion so raw it felt like he was turning himself inside out. "This is what I have been doing, Amelie. When I was not on the phone with lawyers, I was remembering." He pointed the camera at the model. "This is the house, the one I told you about in the desert. It's not a dream anymore. I bought the land last month, an hour outside the city. It was a reckless, financially insane thing to do." He looked back at her, his eyes pleading. "It's for us." Amelie's hands were pressed to her mouth, her breath coming in soft, shaky gasps. Tears were streaming down her face, but these were not tears of sorrow. "I don't care where we live," Leo said, the words pouring out of him, a torrent of last-chance honesty. "Lyon, New York, a shack in the desert. I will sell this apartment. I will move to France. I will learn to speak French badly and embarrass you in front of your friends. I will do whatever it takes. I need to know. Are you still in this with me? Is there still an us to build this for?" The screen was bright, unforgiving. A poor substitute for touch. But in that moment, it was their entire world. "Close your eyes, Amélie," he whispered. She obeyed, her eyelids fluttering shut. "I want you to remember," he said, his voice dropping, becoming a soft, intimate caress. "Remember the motel room in Colorado, the sound of the rain on the roof." He paused, letting the memory take shape for both of them across the miles. "Do you remember how it felt? When the world was just the two of us in that room, the way you put your hand on my chest, right here." He touched his own chest. Safety in it. The quiet. He was not describing an act, but a feeling. He was rebuilding their intimacy with words, with shared memory. He spoke of the trust in her touch, the tenderness in the way she held him, the silent communication of skin on skin that had said everything they were too afraid to say out loud. He was making love to her soul, across an ocean, through a screen. "I remember," she finally whispered, her voice thick and trembling. "I remember everything." She opened her eyes, and the look she gave him was a vow, a homecoming, a promise that transcended any distance. It was a look of profound, soul-bearing reunion. He brought his fingers to his lips and pressed a kiss there, then touched them to the camera lens. On her screen, in her small room in Lyon, Amélie did the same, and the kiss they blew across the Atlantic was more real, more charged with love and hope than any physical kiss had ever been. A year later, the arrivals gate at Lyon-Saint-Exupéry Airport hummed with the usual chaos of reunions. Yet for Leo and Amélie, their meeting was a pocket of profound stillness in the swirling crowd. He had done it. He had sold his apartment, packed his life into storage, and put his career on hold. He was here, in France, with 2 large suitcases and a heart full of terrifying, beautiful certainty. When she saw him, she didn't run. She walked towards him, her eyes locked on his, and when they were finally close enough to touch, they didn't crash together in a frantic rush. They melted into a quiet, deep embrace. It was an embrace that spoke of battles won, of patience rewarded, of a love that had been tested by law and distance and had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger. It was an embrace that said simply, "We made it home." Their new life was built piece by piece, with the same deliberate care Leo had once reserved for his blueprints. Their apartment in Lyon was small but filled with light, the scent of fresh paint from Amélie's canvases mingling with the aroma of the strong coffee Leo was learning to appreciate. He enrolled in a French course, stumbling through verb conjugations and charming her with his terrible, earnest accent. He spent his afternoons with his sketchbook, not capturing the bones of the city but its life, the way the afternoon light fell on the Rhône, the bustling energy of the market, the quiet concentration on Amélie's face as she worked. She in turn was painting again, but with a newfound power. Her colours were bolder, her strokes more confident. The fear she had confessed under the desert stars had been replaced by a quiet strength. Her art was no longer an escape, but an expression of a life she was actively, joyfully choosing. They were building a home together, not with wood and nails, but with shared moments, patient understanding and unwavering commitment. One evening, rain pattered against the tall French windows of their apartment, a soft, familiar rhythm that echoed the storm in Colorado. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the room. Leo sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa, sketching Amélie as she sat curled in a chair, reading. The framed drawing he had made of her on their first day in Soho now hung on their wall, a constant reminder of their beginning. She looked up as if feeling his gaze, and put her book down. She came to him, kneeling in front of him, and gently took the sketchbook from his hands, setting it aside. She said nothing, only looked at him, her eyes full of a love that was now deep and settled, as calm and vast as the ocean that had once separated them. He reached up, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking the delicate line of her jaw, as if committing her to memory. He looked into her eyes, and in their depths, he saw their entire story. The Brooklyn Bridge, the desert stars, the flickering light of 1,000 video calls. Then he kissed her. It was a kiss that was a homecoming, and it deepened with a year of unspoken longing. Her hands, tangled in his hair, drew him closer. His slid from her waist to the small of her back, urging her against him until there was no space left between them, only the soft whisper of fabric. It was a barrier that suddenly felt unbearable. With a shared, unspoken understanding, he gently eased her back onto the soft rug, the lamplight casting a warm golden glow over them. The world narrowed to this sacred space, the sound of the rain outside a gentle percussion to the frantic beating of their hearts. The kiss never broke, but it changed, becoming a language of its own as his fingers found the hem of her sweater. He drew it upward, his movements slow and deliberate, an act of unveiling. The cool air on her skin was followed instantly by the warmth of his hands, tracing the curve of her spine. Learning her as if for the first time, she helped him, her own hands clumsy with need. She worked at the buttons of his shirt, wanting to feel the solid warmth of him, the living proof that he was truly here. Clothes fell away, not in a rush of frantic passion, but with a quiet reverence, an unwrapping of souls. Lying there in the soft light, skin to skin, was the purest form of honesty they had ever known. He looked at her, his gaze full of a wonder that stole her breath, and she saw her own adoration reflected back. Every fear, every mile of distance, every lonely night had led them to this moment of profound and perfect vulnerability. When he finally moved to join their bodies, it was a slow, deliberate coming home. It was a breath held and then released, a quiet gasp of arrival. There was no pain, only a sense of completion, of two halves of a whole finally clicking into place. He moved within her in a rhythm that matched the gentle patter of the rain against the glass, a rhythm of patience, of promises kept, of a love that had crossed an ocean to find its harbour. She arched to meet him, her body remembering a language her mind had only dreamed of for so long. It was a silent conversation of skin and breath and shared warmth, erasing every mile they had ever been apart, consecrating the little apartment in Lyon as their first true home. Every touch was a vow, every sigh a prayer of gratitude, culminating in a quiet, shattering release that was not an ending, but the true beginning of everything. Later, curled up together, they watched a video on a tablet. It was a live feed from a muddy plot of land an hour outside of New York. In the grey morning light, a construction crew was laying the first foundation stones for their house. Their house. They had learned that love is not about defying time, but about filling it, moment by patient moment, and that the longest distance between two hearts is not measured in miles, but in the silence of unspoken fear, a silence they had finally and forever learned to break. My dearest April. The cabin stood as a bastion against the Minnesota autumn, its pinewood walls holding the warmth of a dying fire and 70 years of memories. For Arthur, now 90 and alone, it was a fortress of solitude. He sat at the small kitchen table, the scarred wood cool beneath his forearms, and stared at the 2 cups of coffee he had made. It was a ritual as ingrained as breathing, a habit that death had not yet broken. 1 cup for him, black and strong, and 1 for April, with a splash of cream. The steam from her cup rose in a delicate, ghostly waltz, a silent testament to an absence that was more a presence than anything else in the room. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in on him from all sides, a terrible, suffocating blanket. He rose, his joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and groans, and began to walk through the cabin. His hand, gnarled and liver-spotted, trailed along the rough-hewn walls, a blind man reading the braille of his own life. He paused in the bedroom, his fingers brushing against her reading glasses on the nightstand, the lenses still smudged with her fingerprints. In the corner, a half-finished quilt lay in a basket, the needle still threaded. A project paused mid-stitch as if she had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back to finish it. Every object was an echo, a whisper of her name in the crushing quiet. He looked out the window at the vast grey lake, its surface a mirror reflecting the sombre sky. A distant loon let out a mournful cry, a lonely liquid note that seemed to amplify his solitude, to give voice to the aching void in his chest. 70 years, he murmured, his voice a rusty whisper. 70 years they give you. 70 years, and you think you've learned everything about a person, but they never teach you how to make coffee for one. His daughter, Sarah, called later that morning, her voice a lifeline of concern from a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. "How are you doing, Dad?" she asked, her tone gentle, cautious. He gave her the usual hollow reassurances, but she saw right through them. "I spoke with that grief counsellor again," she said, her voice hesitant. "She suggested... well, she said that some people find comfort in writing things down, like letters." Arthur scoffed, a dry, rattling sound in his throat. "Letters? To whom? The postman doesn't deliver to the great beyond, Sarah." It was a modern foolishness, this idea of writing to the dead as if they could read the words. But the seed of the idea, once planted, began to take root in the fertile soil of his loneliness. That night, sleep was a fickle visitor, offering only brief moments of respite before the memories and the silence would come rushing back in. He lay in their bed, the space beside him a cold, empty expanse, and felt a familiar wave of anger and despair wash over him. Finally, he gave up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed and shuffling to the old writing desk in the corner of the room. He switched on the small lamp, its golden glow a small island of light in the sea of darkness, and took out a sheet of heavy cream-coloured stationery and his old fountain pen. The pen was a gift from April, a beautiful thing of polished wood and silver, and it felt warm and familiar in his hand. He unscrewed the cap, the faint scent of ink filling the air, and for a long moment he simply stared at the blank page, the words a tangled knot in his throat. Then, with a trembling hand, he began to write. "My dearest April, you were supposed to be here. The coffee is cold and the silence is a terrible noise. They say this is supposed to help. I don't see how. Words are just ink on a page. They can't bring back the warmth of your hand in mine. They can't fill the space in the bed, in this house, in my life. You were the one who always knew what to say, the one who could fill the quiet with your laughter, your stories, your love, and now there's only silence. I don't know how to do this, April. I don't know how to be without you." He wrote until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, filling the page with his pain, his anger, his despair. The words were clumsy, raw, a torrent of grief that he had held back for too long. When he finally set the pen down, the page was tear-stained and ink-smeared, a messy, chaotic testament to a broken heart. He didn't feel better, not exactly, but he felt something. A small flickering ember of connection in the cold, empty darkness, and for now that was enough. The days bled into weeks, the vibrant hues of autumn faded into the muted tones of late fall. The trees, now bare and skeletal, stood as sentinels along the shore, their branches reaching up to a sky the colour of slate. The first frost had come, dusting the world in a delicate layer of silver, and the air had a crisp, clean bite to it. Arthur continued to write, the daily letters to April becoming a ritual, a comfort, a way to navigate the long, empty hours of the day. He wrote about the weather, about the birds at the feeder, about the mundane details of a life that felt anything but. But after a while he found himself stuck, the well of his present-day grief running dry. He would sit at his desk, pen in hand, and find that he had nothing more to say about the cold coffee or the oppressive silence. One morning he found himself staring out at the lake, its surface still and glassy, and a memory sharp and vivid rose to the surface of his mind. He was a boy again, all gangly limbs and nervous energy, standing on this very shore with a girl whose laughter was like the chiming of bells. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he could almost feel the warmth of the summer sun on his face, the soft sandy earth beneath his feet. He could almost smell the sweet scent of her hair, a mix of sunshine and wildflowers, and in that moment he knew what he had to do. He would not write about his pain today, he would write about their joy. My dearest April, I was thinking about the day I proposed to you. Not with a diamond, you never wanted a diamond. You said they were just compressed carbon, cold and lifeless. But a stone had a story. I spent a week searching this shore, turning over every rock until I found it. It was a perfect heart shape, smooth and grey, worn down by the lake for 1,000 years, just waiting for us. You held it in your palm, and your eyes, they sparkled brighter than any diamond ever could. You said yes without a moment's hesitation, your laughter echoing across the water. You always saw the poetry in things, April. You were the poetry in my life. The words began to pour out of him then, a river of memories that had been dammed up for too long. He wrote about their wedding, a simple affair in the small country church, with wildflowers in her hair and a world of hope in their hearts. He wrote about their first tiny apartment, with its sloping floors and draughty windows, and how they had painted it a cheerful yellow, a defiant splash of colour against the greyness of the world. He wrote about the joy and the struggle of raising their children, the sleepless nights and the scraped knees, the funny, imperfect moments that build a life. He wrote about the time their son Tom had tried to help him fix the car and had ended up covered in grease from head to toe, and how April had just laughed and said, "Well, at least he has his father's enthusiasm." He wrote and wrote, the letters forming a chronology of their love, a testament to a life lived to the fullest. As he wrote, the cabin, once a place of suffocating silence, began to fill with the ghosts of their past. He could almost hear the echo of children's laughter in the quiet rooms, the scent of cinnamon and apples from a remembered pie wafting from the kitchen. He would look at an old family photo on the mantelpiece, a faded image of the four of them, young and smiling, and a wave of nostalgia so powerful it almost brought him to his knees would wash over him. "We thought we had nothing back then," he whispered to the empty room, a small sad smile playing on his lips. "We had everything." The letters were no longer just a way to cope with his grief. They were a way to keep her alive, to keep their love alive, to rewrite their story, not as a tragedy that ended in loss, but as a love story that would never truly end. The dead of winter descended upon the lake, a world of stark white and frozen silence. The water, once a vibrant living thing, was now a solid, unmoving sheet of ice, its surface a blank white canvas stretching to the horizon. The cabin, once a cosy refuge, now felt like a lonely outpost in a frozen wasteland. Arthur, bundled in a thick wool sweater, would sit by the fire, the flames a welcome splash of colour in the monochrome world outside, and write his daily letter to April. He had filled pages and pages with their happy memories, a highlight reel of their life together. But as the winter deepened, so too did his introspection. He knew that to truly honour their love, he had to remember it all, not just the sunshine, but the storms as well. One morning he hesitated before putting pen to paper, a difficult memory rising to the surface, a memory he had long tried to bury. It was the memory of their biggest fight, a rift that had threatened to tear them apart. He was tempted to push it back down, to choose a happier memory instead, but he knew that to do so would be a disservice to their love, to the strength of a bond that had been tested and had emerged stronger, and so with a deep breath he began to write. "My dearest April, I've been thinking about the fight, the big one, the one that almost broke us. I was so sure I was right, so stubborn. I wanted to take that job in the city, to chase after some hollow idea of success that had been drilled into me. And you fought me tooth and nail. I thought you were being selfish, that you were holding me back. I said things, cruel, thoughtless things that I have regretted every day since. The silence in this house now is nothing compared to the silence that fell between us then. It was a cold, heavy thing, a wall of ice that I thought we would never be able to break through. He described the fight in painful detail, the sharp, angry words that had been thrown like stones, the slammed door that had echoed through the house like a gunshot. He wrote about the days of stony silence that followed, the way they had moved around each other like strangers, the air thick with unspoken resentment. But he didn't end the memory there. He forced himself to remember how they had found their way back to each other, how the ice had finally begun to thaw. It was the third night of our silent war. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest. And then you came to me. You didn't say anything at first. You just took my hand, your own small and warm in my cold, clumsy one. And then you said, "I'm not afraid of being poor, Arthur. I'm not afraid of starting over, but I am afraid of losing you." And in that moment I understood. You weren't fighting about the money or the move, you were fighting for us. It took me 3 days of stony silence to understand that. And in that moment I knew that I would rather be a beggar with you than a king without you. He remembered the profound relief of reconciliation, the way they had clung to each other in the darkness, their tears mingling on the pillow. He remembered the feeling of her hand, small but firm, finding his in the dark, a silent promise of forgiveness, of a love that was stronger than any disagreement. The memory, once a source of shame and regret, was now a testament to the resilience of their bond. "A marriage isn't a smooth road," he said to the crackling fire, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a landscape with mountains and valleys. It's the climbing together that matters." Outside, the frozen lake stretched on, a seemingly lifeless expanse. But beneath the ice, life still stirred, waiting for the spring thaw. And in the warm, firelit cabin, Arthur knew that even in the coldest, darkest of times, their love had always been there, a steady, unwavering flame. The first signs of spring arrived with a whisper, a subtle shift in the air, a hint of warmth in the afternoon sun. The ice on the lake, once a solid, unyielding sheet, began to crack and groan, the sound a mournful song of a dying winter. The thaw mirrored Arthur's own emotional state, a slow, painful breaking apart of the grief that had held him captive for so long. He had written his way through the autumn of their love, the winter of their struggles, and now, as the world outside began to reawaken, he found the courage to write about their final days together. He described her illness in stark, unsparing detail, the way it had slowly, insidiously stolen her from him. He wrote about holding her hand, her once strong grip now frail and weak, the skin as thin and fragile as parchment. He wrote about the conversations that grew quieter, the words that became fewer, the things that were left unsaid because they were already understood. The letters were a painful litany of loss, a chronicle of a long, slow goodbye. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk, the weight of these sad memories became too much to bear. His mind, in an act of rebellion, sought its opposite, a memory of a time when they were at their most vital, their most alive. He pushed the sad letter aside and started a new one, his pen flying across the page, his heart filled with the defiant joy. He chose to remember their 25th anniversary, a golden weekend spent at the cabin, just the two of them, my dearest April. Do you remember our 25th anniversary? We came back to the cabin, just the two of us. The kids were grown and we were alone for the first time in years. We danced on the porch to an old song on the radio. Moon River, I think it was. You were wearing that blue dress, the one that matched your eyes. The moonlight caught the silver in your hair, and I remember thinking that you had never been more beautiful. I led you inside. The fire was roaring, casting a warm, flickering glow on your skin. He paused, the memory so vivid it was as if he were living it all over again. He could almost smell the scent of wood smoke and pine, the faint, sweet perfume of her skin. He could almost hear the soft strains of the music, the crackle of the fire, the sound of her laughter. He took a deep breath and continued to write, the words a torrent of passion and longing. I kissed you then, not with the frantic energy of our youth, but with a deep, reverent intimacy, a kiss that tasted of wine and memories and a love that had weathered a quarter of a century of storms. I kissed you like I was rediscovering a beloved country, each touch a testament to the years we had shared. I remember the feel of your dress as it slipped from your shoulders, the soft, warm weight of your body in my arms. Your hands traced the lines of my face, a map you knew by heart, yet still explored with wonder. His hand trembled as he wrote, the memories a potent cocktail of joy and sorrow. He described the gentle undressing, the slow, deliberate exploration of each other's bodies, a rediscovery of the familiar, a celebration of a desire that had not faded with time, but had deepened, matured, become something more profound, more sacred. When our bodies came together, it was a slow, warm tide of feeling, a dance of need and tenderness, a physical affirmation of our lifelong union. There was a raw, aching vulnerability in that moment, a silent acknowledgement of our own mortality, of the preciousness of the time we had left. It was less about passion and more about a profound physical communion, a merging of two souls who had become one. In that moment, with the firelight dancing on your skin and the sound of your sighs filling the air, I knew that I was home. You were my home, April. You always were. He set the pen down, his heart aching with a bittersweet mixture of love and loss. Outside, the ice on the lake continued to crack and thaw, the water beneath struggling to break free. And in the quiet cabin, Arthur felt his own heart cracking open, the grief that had been frozen for so long finally beginning to melt away, leaving behind a love that was as vast and as deep as the lake itself. Summer arrived in a blaze of glory, a vibrant explosion of life and colour. The lake, now fully thawed, was a sparkling expanse of blue, its surface alive with the dance of sunlight. The trees, once skeletal and bare, were now lush and green, their leaves rustling in the warm breeze. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming roses and the cheerful song of birds. The cabin, once a place of sombre reflection, was now bathed in a gentle, peaceful light. Arthur, looking frailer now but with a deep, profound calm in his eyes, sat at his desk and wrote his final letter. It was short and simple, the words of a man who had finally found his peace. My dearest April, the lake is so beautiful this morning. The roses are in bloom and the air is filled with their perfume. Thank you, my love, for everything. For the laughter and the tears, the joy and the sorrow, the mountains and the valleys. For a life that was more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. I think I'll rest now. I love you. I'll see you soon. He placed the letter on the neat stack with all the others, tied with a simple piece of twine, a lifetime of love contained within its pages. He went to their bed, lay down for a nap, and in the quiet of the summer afternoon, with the scent of roses drifting in through the open window, he closed his eyes and passed away peacefully in his sleep. Weeks later, his children, Sarah and Tom, now middle-aged themselves with children of their own, came to the cabin to sort through his things. The silence that greeted them was different from the one their father had known. It was a peaceful silence, a silence filled with memories, with the lingering presence of a great love. It was Sarah who found the letters, neatly stacked on the old writing desk, a tangible legacy of a love she'd only ever seen from the outside. She sat on the porch, the warm summer sun on her face, and began to read the first letter. Her brother, Tom, joined her, and together they read through the seasons of their father's grief and remembrance. They read about the cold coffee and the terrible silence, about the heart-shaped stone and the wildflower wedding. They laughed at the funny stories they had never known, at the tales of their own childhood mischief seen through their father's loving eyes, and they wept as they discovered the profound depth of their parents' love, learning more about them in these pages than they had in a lifetime. One of the last letters Sarah read described a simple, perfect moment, a memory that captured the very essence of their love. April, already showing signs of her age, had fallen asleep in her armchair with a book in her lap. Arthur had gently taken the book from her hands, placed a blanket over her, and simply sat and watched her sleep, his heart overwhelmed by a love so vast it filled the quiet room. He had leaned over and kissed her forehead, and in her sleep she had smiled. Sarah looked up from the letter, her eyes filled with tears, a mix of sorrow and joy. She looked out at the lake, its surface sparkling in the summer sun, a timeless witness to a love story that had finally come full circle. "He didn't die of a broken heart," she whispered to her brother, her voice thick with emotion. He wrote his way back to her, until their story was finally complete. And in the quiet of the summer afternoon, with the scent of roses in the air and the sound of the lake lapping gently against the shore, they knew that their parents were together again, their love story not over, but simply beginning its next chapter,